Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a happy Onam to all of you. I'm sure the celebration must be over. Welcome to this yet another chapter of the Madras Day celebrations, or Madras Week as we can call it now. And is this the first or the second? This is the first lecture of the Madras Musings, and without much ado, I'll hand over to the senior general manager, Mr. Ilango, who's here, whose courtesy and hospitality we have just enjoyed. So I would like him to say a few words before Sri Ram takes it on and finishes it.
Yeah, on behalf of the entire GRT Hotels and Resorts, we want to welcome you, and we are very happy to be associated with the Madras Day. Okay, now it has become a Madras Week celebration. So even in the past also we were associated with it, and then I think after a period of some gap, now we are associated. So a warm welcome to all of you, and I request Mr. Sriram to take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Satyan, and thank you, Ilango. I had kind of resigned myself to a virtual week, which is definitely better than no week, which was last year, when I just said we are not feeling up to it, and Madras Musings will do nothing. And then that's exactly what we did. We did nothing last year. And then this year we decided that there must be some kind of celebration. It's very difficult for a magazine like Madras Musings, which is, even when it was born, it was a very aged and venerable magazine, in the sense that its mental age was already 100 or so. And so to get it to understand the digital world, and then within a matter of 1 week, Twitter, Facebook, and then, YouTube channel, everything has been a bit of a shock. The only thing we've had so far is a website that we used to update whenever we felt like it. But now suddenly, to become answerable to people, and then they are asking us things like, where is the link in this poster? First time we are hearing words like link in a poster. We thought that images don't get anything like that. So it's all been very tiring and exhausting. And then suddenly when somebody said, you remember the old world, Satyan came and said, we must have a talk. I said, very good. As long as we are not looking at a camera and then looking at the chat box to see who is asking what question, and all, very, very tiring these things are. The other problem is that here you have this wonderful invention, which is the mic. So you don't have to exhaust your lungs. Whereas in that one, all the time you have people saying. And then they are also doing this. They bring their ear to the camera. They don't have very appealing ears, some of them, very difficult to watch those ears. So, or nostrils for that matter. So definitely it was far better to come finally and, be a part of this kind of an event. That's okay. I mean, I'm sure those who are watching online will not mind, because they've also gone through this. And eventually, I'm sure I look forward to seeing them all in person, because there's nothing like that old world meeting up with people. And as Bharat there asked me, you're missing all the people who used to come and eat 25 samosas, 85 cutlets, and then, collect all the gulab jamuns in one shot and then swallow them during the meeting, etc., etc. Yes. Yeah, we've had such wonderful times when we look back at all that. So my thanks to Satyan, my thanks to Ilango, my thanks to GRT for having made this possible. And I selected a topic which is not new, something that I have written about earlier. And Mr. Muttaya, my guru, has also written about it earlier. And before I get on to this, I must also remember Mr. Muttaya for one thing. I keep his photograph on my desk all the time. So whenever I'm writing, whenever I'm working, he's always smiling down at me. Last year, he didn't smile. He hated the thought that there was no Madras Week celebrations. So this year, when, I finally decided that we'll have these 8 programs, he was simply delighted. And then when there was an extra program, Satyan said that he would speak on Porchavakam, which is on the coming Sunday. Mr. Muttaya almost jumped out of the photograph in joy, because Satyan has been his favorite son in the world of public relations. And, Satyan and he went back a long way together. And so and then finally one more event got added, some quiz by somebody in Pune, Ashwin Bhandarkar in Pune. So there are totally 12 events or some such thing out of earlier when as compared to what it was 8 or 9. So things have actually got bigger, despite the fact that we are on a virtual platform. So this story, Madras Money for Yale University, is about how, yeah, we'll have to switch off these lights, is about how Elihu Yale, to put it very simply, who was governor of Madras between 1687 and 1692, how he made enough money to keep himself and his family in happiness in England, and also had a little bit left over to fund a college in the United States of America, which took his name. The Yale legacy is now a very troubled one, because there are questions being asked about how can a university be named after a rank colonial administrator who, and the worst that people are talking about is the fact that he was probably into slave trade as well at one time. And therefore, the question that is being asked is, why is a university still named after him? Particularly because there is a college under Yale University called the John Calhoun College, which has changed its name because John Calhoun was a slave trader. And so they are saying that when a college can change its name, why can't the university also change its name? But Yale was a great survivor, as I will show you during the course of this presentation. And he probably he will survive this also, because historical records are so vague about his role in slave trading that if there is one side of it which says that he was into slave trade, there is an equally powerful argument that he was not into slave trade. This is the kind of man that he was. He covered his tracks wherever he went, and that probably accounts for his success. Now, during the course of this presentation, you may find a lot of parallels to people of Chennai, of Tamil Nadu politics. All such resemblances and coincidences are entirely coincidental. And it is entirely in your mind that you are able to identify these people. I'm not going to stop and highlight those incidents, but as you go along, you will find that there are lots of parallels to latter day happenings in the history of the city. But Yale was born in 1649 in the 17th century, as is very clear. And that is the first time probably in the history of the world when the world itself is becoming one. When the impact of happening in one part of the world is being felt in yet another part of the world. Prior to that, all happenings were localized. They could have been in one continent, they could have been in one country, in one city. But now for the first time, we find that there are significant currents that impact the happenings across multiple continents. Of course, we know Vasco da Gama had come in 1498, and thereafter things had begun to get fast-tracked. But Yale's is probably one of those early lives where he spanned really a large part of the globe in what he did. Him, it was a matter of great pride that he was a much traveled man. But Yale's life, very unusually for its time, North America, Europe, and Asia. So all three continents, he would have significant incidents in his life, which would be associated with all these places. So the Yale family was a pretty landed family. They lived in Wales, in a place called Plas Grono. And Yale's great-great-grandfather was a Dr. Yale who had left behind property. There was a country house in which the family lived and all that. Yale's grandfather died fairly young. And then Yale's grandmother married for a second time. She married a man called Theophilus Eaton, who was a Puritan. And naturally, because he was a Puritan, he came into conflict with the reign of King Charles I. And in the 1630s, Theophilus Eaton decided to take his wife and his young children to America, because he decided that there was a new continent that was coming up and they would be able to live there and practice their puritanical interpretation of Christianity. And so Theophilus Eaton makes the move to North America from England in the 1630s. And they settle down in Boston. Later, they move because they don't like the atmosphere of Boston, and they move. They go to a place where they drive out the native people, probably killing many of them as well. And finally, they name that place as New Haven in Connecticut. And that is where they begin to live. So Yale's father grew up there. And though he was born of the first husband of Yale's grandmother, but Yale, the stepfather, took the stepchildren also with him to the United States of America. So David Yale, who is the father, grows up in the United States of America. When he grows old, he, for some reason, does not like the puritanical ways of his stepfather, particularly because I think that there was a lot of conflict between mother and stepfather over their interpretation of what is Puritanism. The mother, the commonly interpreted story is that the commonly given out story is that the mother was subject to bouts of hysteria. And because she was subject to that, she was publicly insulted, committed to a trial and things like that. So the mother appears to have suffered quite a bit. So David Yale, when he became old enough, decides to move and goes back to Boston. And there he becomes an attorney at law. And finally, he marries a woman called Ursula. And they have a child in April 1649. And that is our Elihu. Elihu has an elder brother born, and then there is a sister who dies in her infancy. And then two more brothers are going to follow after Elihu. One of them is Thomas, who will have a significant role to play in Madras city as well. So Elihu is, the very name Elihu appears to be a bit of a mystery, because there is no satisfactory explanation in the family records as to where this name comes from, because earlier ancestors were definitely not named Elihu. It appears that there must have been a Welsh saint or a Welsh ancestor after whom this particular name was given to him. He was 3 when the family decides to, when his father, David Yale, and the mother and the children, they decide to move back to England. So this is in 1651 when the family comes back to England. And thereafter, they live there. Elihu is sent to a school in London, a private school. Then he goes to St. Paul's School in London. And in 1665, the Great Plague breaks out. And hardly anybody is expected to survive the Great Plague. And if you remember, when the second wave of COVID hit us, we were all sent a wave of WhatsApp messages which said, these are the things that you should note down on a piece of paper so that your descendants will know where you have left the insurance policy, where is the car key, where is the cupboard key, etc., etc. So exactly like that, David Yale makes a will where he very clearly lists out all his properties, his belongings and things like that. What should go to son number 1, what should go to son number 2, son number 3. We know from that the family was well placed. The father had been very successful in whatever he was doing as a businessman, as a merchant. And so there was a decent amount of money in the family. But he doesn't die in the Great Plague. The whole family survives the Great Plague. In 1666, when the Great Fire of London comes, which is the other woodcut that you see over there, their house is burned to the ground, but they all survive that as well. Thereafter, Elihu grows up. And in 1671, the question is, what is to be done with him? And his father and his elder brother then decide that it would be good if he joins the East India Company as a writer. So this is the old East India Company office in Leadenhall Street. And they go there. They happen to know one of the directors. Then as now, those appointments are all, so, we will go there. And number ivardane, our pathapar. So you go there and you meet up with him, and then you get the, so Elihu is admitted as a writer. The father stands surety for his good conduct, which means, a sum of 500 pounds, which will be held by the company. And then after some training, Elihu is then shipped out to India. He leaves in 1670. He arrives in June 1672. In December 1671, he embarks. It takes 6 months. And on June 23rd, 1672, he arrives in Madras city. At that time, the governor of the board of the East India Company is Sir Josiah Child, who is Hosea Child, actually, who is one of the most domineering East India Company directors that you can think of. He monitors every aspect of what life is in all the colonial establishments. He's writing letters to them practically every day, dictating matters of policy and so on and so forth. And everybody lives in mortal terror of what Sir Hosea Child would think of. So it's kind of it's an establishment that is not so much a meritocracy as it's more an autocracy. And the writer gets a salary of £5 per annum, which today may appear a small amount, but even then it was not a very generous figure. So the governor himself of a colonial city like Madras would get a salary of £100 per annum. That was it as per the East India Company records. So Hosea was very clear that all the trade that happens in the name of the East India Company, the revenue must come to the company and it should not go to anyone else, which is very good. But in reality, everything except revenue to the company was taken care of by all the employees who worked in the various. So when we say, அந்த காலத்துல இங்கிலீஷ்காரா ரொம்ப honest-ஆ இருந்தா இப்போதான் எல்லாம் கெட்டு போயிடுது. No, they were as corrupt. The other thing is that corruption, the Mughal Empire was also corrupt. I'm sure there must have been corruption even before. I don't think human nature has really changed all that much over the years. All the merchants in the East India Company establishments in India indulged freely in what was known as private trade. So while they worked for the company, they were always doing business on their own. And they were salting away the money, which would then be transmitted by various methods, not as cash, but in kind. So it would go back as precious stones, it would go back as rugs, it would go back as bales of cloth. And that is how it was eventually encashed in England, and many of them made a lot of money on it. The company tried to keep a close watch, which is why most of the governors and agents of the East India Company, they rarely had an honorable retirement. All of them would reach a level when finally they would be sacked. And that would be the end of their tenure with the East India Company. So this is how it was. He arrives here in 1672 as a writer. This is an early, of course, this is a 1790s picture of Madras. So we are looking at almost 120 years after Elihu was here. But it gives you a reasonable idea of how the establishment was at that time. And you can see that there is no harbor. The ships are all parked 2 miles in the sea. There is a catamaran that is getting ready to go to. Many catamarans are already in the surf. They are going to pick up the goods and the passengers who are going to be brought back to the fort. In Elihu's time, that tall flagstaff that you see there was not there. When he came here, this would have been absent. It would have, and it was a much smaller fort at that time. This shows the fort practically as it stands today in an area of almost 100 acres. But at that time, it would have been not more than what we today see as the Assembly and Secretariat building. That is all. That would have been the size of the fort, then gradually expanding to the left and the right. The governors, or at that time, they were known as agents of the East India Company. And Sir William Langhorne was the agent in charge of the Madras establishment at that time. Elihu joins here as a writer. And even in his first year, he comes to the notice of the agent, who says that this is a person worthy of, keeping note of, that he is very capable, he's very diligent in what he is doing. So William Langhorne would eventually retire very honorably and go back to England, where he would become a director on the board of the East India Company as well. So this friendship would stand Elihu in very good stead in later years, as we shall see. And after Sir William Langhorne, you had a man called Gifford, who was a fairly weak-minded governor of Madras. And it was during his time that we find Elihu rising very, very rapidly in the service of the East India Company. So he, as I said, he joins as a writer. Then he becomes a factor. Then from a factor, he becomes assistant warehouse keeper and mint master. Then from that, he becomes the customer who is in charge of all the customs of the fort. Eventually, he rises high enough to become second in the council. And therefore, when William Gifford goes out on tours of the various other establishments of the East India Company, Elihu actually acts as governor, acting governor of the fort. So between 1671 and 1680, it's a it's a period. Sorry, not 1680, 1671 and 1687. He is rising quite rapidly in the service of the East India Company. Between Langhorne and Gifford, you had a governor called Stransham Master. And Master was the man who decided that the fort needed a magnificent church to be built inside it so that the Protestants or the Anglicans in Fort St. George would be able to pray, in the manner to which they were accustomed in England. And surprisingly, till that time, this is 1678, there was no church for the Protestants inside Fort St. George. They all used the governor's chambers as their prayer hall. That is where their services were conducted. On the other hand, there was a flourishing Catholic church inside the fort, which is where the Namakkal Kavingiyar Maligai today stands. And that was where the Church of St. Andrews stood. That is because all the women in Fort St. George in initial days were Portuguese. And the children who were born to them, they were all brought up in the Catholic faith. And the East India Company servants were very keen that those women should be kept happy, their children should be kept happy. So the Catholic Church was the one that really was given predominance. And nobody bothered about building a Protestant church. Eventually, Stransham Master would build it. And everybody contributed to the construction. It was a kind of a crowdfunding of its time. And what we find is that in 1678, Master had a salary of £100. He gave £30. Elihu had a salary of £10 and he gave £6, which is a lot of money in proportion to what he was earning. It is quite likely that even then he had started earning money on the sly in other ways. And we hear of stories of, shipments arriving from England. And sometimes, the addressee's name would be lost. And so they would all be delivered on the beach in Madras as consignee unknown. So then merchants would get together and buy those goods. And then they would sell them at a speculation or a profit. It would be claret or it will be ale or some kind of a drink. Sometimes it would be Western clothes that would arrive. And Elihu appears to have been in the forefront of all these speculative ventures. So he and his fellow junior merchants would get together. They would pool the money and then they would buy the stuff and all that. So probably he was making money quite well at this point of time. And this was also when women were coming down from England in increasing numbers. So initially, as we all know, there were the Portuguese women who were taking care of the East India Company servants' biological needs. But over a period of time, we had more and more English women coming down. And they were the women who did not get married in England. So they didn't find a proper suitor. So they would all be put on ships and sent out to India, because this was a bachelor's establishment and anybody and everybody could hope to get married at very short notice. So these were known as the fishing fleet. So they came here fishing for husbands. So in 1678, we know, as per a census that was taken at that time, that there were around 40 English families living in Fort St. George. And there were 3 women who were single. One was a widow and 2 other women had not got married at all. One of them was a woman called Catherine Barker. Catherine Barker had arrived a year previous from England. Normally, women would hope to get married within a week of arrival. If they had not got married within 3 months, then there was something seriously wrong. But if they didn't get married for 1 year, then there was something very, very wrong. And Catherine Barker very clearly belonged to that category. Catherine Barker, it is said, had set her cap on Elihu. But Elihu had set his sights much, much higher. The second in the council, that is the man who was just below the governor, was a man called Joseph Hinmer. He was second in command of the fort. Joseph Hinmer's wife was a Catherine Elford, whom he had married in England several years earlier. And they both had, already they had 4 children in Madras. And Hinma became very close to Yale. Yale was still only assistant warehouse keeper at that time. Hinma, second in command of the fort, was very, very close to Yale. And it became very clear that Hinma was very ill. He was not going to survive for very long. Yale had already set his sights on the Mrs. Hinma, on Mrs. Also a Catherine. So in his horoscope, it was very clear he had to marry a Catherine of some kind. And so he was getting ready to marry Catherine Hinma. And eventually, Joseph Hinma dies in 1680, sometime early in 1680. And within 10 months, the two of them are going to get married. Catherine Hinma is going to marry Elihu Yale. In the meantime, Joseph Hinma himself, his body is taken to what was known as the Guava Garden. The Guava Garden is where today the High Court and the Law College stand. At that time, this was the burial ground for the East India Company. The bodies were not buried inside the fort, but they were taken to the north of the fort. And there was this orchard, which was this Guava Garden, where huge monuments were built in masonry, under which these people were all buried. Much later in the 1750s, those monuments would all be flattened because they were considered to be security risks. One monument alone would survive, and that was Joseph Hinma's monument. It is still standing on Esplanade Road. If you go into the Law College campus, you can see it. So this is where Joseph Hinma was buried, and this is the stone that was put on the 28th of May, 1680. He passed away. And by October, Yale was ready to marry Catherine Hinma. I mentioned to you the church to which he had contributed. That church was consecrated a few months earlier in 1680. And the first wedding that would happen in this church was that of Catherine Hinma and Elihu Yale. So they would be man and woman over here. He had, however, ensured that Catherine Barker was not left alone. A very close friend of his was John Nix, who was also an East India Company servant, not as bright as Elihu, but he was a very useful man to have as a sidekick and a number two. So he was very conveniently married off to Catherine Barker, who thereafter becomes Catherine Nix. And the Yales have 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. The Hinmas, or the Nixes, are on the other hand prolific in breeding. They have 10 children. And what is very interesting is almost all the children, Elihu was godfather, and almost all the children had names given after members of Elihu's family. Tongues wagged in Fort St. George. But everybody maintained that the Nixes were very, very happily married, and there was no reason to suspect that there was anything between Elihu and Catherine Nix. But while personally there may not have been anything, professionally, they almost became a partnership like Swan and Edgar or Debenham and Freebody or one of those companies, Marks and Spencer, that kind of thing. It was almost like Yale and Nix. Mrs. Nix became the agent for Elihu Yale in practically every business transaction that he was involved in. By 1681-82, she is recognized as an independent businesswoman in Fort St. George. She's almost certainly the first woman entrepreneur of Madras City. And she had invoices published in her name. She was trading furiously in cloth, and she was making money hand over fist. Obviously, she was a front for Elihu, who was telling her about what was going to be the next item that was getting traded in the company, and so on and so forth. Now, by 1687, Elihu has become number 2 under William Gifford. Gifford then retires, and in 1687, Elihu becomes governor of Fort St. George. And thereafter, there is a golden period of 5 years for the partnership of Yale and Nix. Mr. Nix is conveniently sent off to become the agent at Kunimia. That is Kunimede, which is near Pondicherry. And there he is taking care of the factory at Kunimia. Mrs. Nix, with all the children, is here continuing as agent. Now ships are being sent out in the governor's name for his private trade. They are going to Goa, they are going to China, they are bringing back goods, they are being sold over here. Because they are the governor's ships, they don't have to pay any customs duty, completely exempt. So money is being made that way. and all kinds of transactions. The mind boggles when you read about it. It is not just cloth, which is what the East India Company was trading in. There was timber, there were precious stones, and people, delegations of royal families of Thailand and all come down over here in order to select, get Elihu to select for them the rubies that they need for putting in girdles, in umbrella stands. And it's amazing the kind of jewels that royal families needed. Even their umbrellas needed jeweled stands, and we get one button and it doesn't work most of the time. This is what life has brought us down to. But the biggest transaction is when there is a delegation that comes from Thailand asking for rubies to be fixed on a set of girdles, 3 girdles, and a huge amount of money is charged. Elihu selects the rubies and sends it across. When it goes back to Thailand, the jewelers there say that all this is absolutely worthless. And the transaction has already been completed. The money has been paid. Elihu, of course, defends himself left, right, and center. He says, there's nothing wrong in what I have done. They all came here. They saw what I gave them, and I have only charged fair price. But this was the kind of thing that this man was doing at this point of time. His expertise in precious stones comes from a very unique friendship that he develops with a man called D. Paiva. D. Paiva was an Armenian merchant who specialized in precious stones and lived in Coral Merchant Street in Georgetown. That was where all the Armenian Jews lived, Pavarakarateri. And D. Paiva was the head of the Armenian Jew community. And Hieronima was D. Paiva's wife. And Yale and Hieronima became the closest of friends over a period of time. Yale had this unique talent to find out which woman had what skills, and he managed to make friends with her. So Hieronima was passing on to him the secrets of the precious stone trade, and he was making money on it. D. Paiva eventually dies and was buried at this spot in Mint Street. This was where the Jewish burial ground used to be at one time. And then by the 1980s or 90s, there were only 4 stones left. And one stone, a tree had grown under it. And so the stone was getting elevated every day. And it had reached around 3 feet from the ground. And it was considered to be a local wonder. And then the government, in all its wisdom, decided that this Jewish burial ground should be converted into a school. And so the surviving 4 stones were transported from here. One of them broke in transit, and the other 3 were dumped in Lloyd's Road, where they are still there in a Jewish cemetery. D. Paiva's stone vanished over a period of time, but this is that particular location where D. Paiva was buried. When D. Paiva was buried, Hieronima shifted to Fort St. George and began to live there, and she became Mrs. Yale number 2, practically, so to speak. So Yale lived in this building, in this street, which is called North Street in Georgetown, which stands even today. The Nixes lived just behind, and Hieronima lived to the east on the front. So Yale's house in the middle, Nixes behind. I will not draw any parallels, but this has happened subsequently as well. But this is how life was going on. In 1684, the Yales have a son whom they name as David, and he dies in 1687 at the age of 3. He is then buried in the same obelisk where Joseph Hinmers is buried. And that brings a kind of a huge breakup in the relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Yale. She has had 4 children from her previous marriage to Hinmer, out of whom 2 have already gone back to England to study when Hinmer dies. The other 2 are also sent back to England by Yale. And now she decides to go back with her 2 daughters. And so she leaves India for good, never to come back. Hieronima moves into Yale's house thereafter and becomes his housekeeper. And once again, Madras society must have been delighted by what was happening, but they must have outwardly professed to be shocked by all that the governor was doing at this point of time. Elihu is remembered in Madras for a few things. One is, of course, the flagstaff of Fort St. George, which floated in a shipwreck sometime in early 1688, 148 feet mast, which floated off, and then he gave instructions for it to be brought into Fort St. George. And in 1688, when finally King James II of England gave permission for the Union Jack to be flown from the fort, that wooden flagpole was used for hoisting the flag. And it remained the flagstaff till 1996 or so. So it was the tallest flagstaff in the whole of India at 148 feet. The other aspect, very interesting aspect that we need to remember Elihu Yale for was he insisted that all the streets of Madras be given names. Prior to that, there were no names. And then Fort St. George streets also were given names by him, because he said, when there is a war and you need to station the army at various places, the same place may be referred to by multiple people in multiple names. And can you imagine the kind of confusion that would come about? He obviously forgot that eventually we'd have 50,000 Anna Nagars, 60 Kamarad Salais, 35 KK Nagars, and so on and so forth, causing enormous confusion. But at that time, obviously, he, he had the wisdom to think of it like that. The other aspect was that it was in his time that we got the corporation of this city. So the oldest corporation of the British Empire in 1688, it happens, and when the charter comes, it is met in procession with Devadasis dancing, musicians singing, kettle drums, and then the charter being brought all the way from the harbor to the fort in great celebration. And finally, the corporation is installed in the North Street of Fort St. George. The first mayor of the corporation is Nathaniel Higginson, who, like Elihu, was born in America, a fellow American. But even today, as we all know, you cannot have one party in power in the legislature and another party in the council. If that happens, the party in the legislature will ensure that there is no money given to the council and will emasculate it, which is why Chennai Vasis are very careful. When they vote for a particular party in the legislature, they vote for the same party in the corporation also, so that money flow is taken care of and there is some amount of civic development. So within a year of the mayoralty being established, Higginson falls out with Yale, and Yale stops all funding to the corporation. And after that, it takes quite a while for the money to be given to the corporation and for civic administration to begin. So he begins a very early tradition in our history. This is Fort St. George, very much in Yale's time. And then in Yale's, among the many relics of Yale, there is this statue, this sundial with a character holding it up. This survives now in the Yale University. And this is held up as an instance of Yale profiteering by slave trade. The figure below, kneeling, holding up something, is all very clear as to what it stands for. In Yale's time, and this is shocking when you come to read of it, because I didn't know of it earlier. Apparently, the East India Company servants used to kidnap men and children and women and export them wholesale to other parts of the colonies, where they would be indentured or bonded labor for the rest of their lives with no chance of ever coming back. Shipholds of these people apparently would go out from Madras and other places. And many would die in the inhuman conditions in which they were being sent out from here. And it appears that in Yale's time, this trade was quite high. But this is where, as I say, we are not very sure. On the one hand, people say that Yale was in slave trade himself. The records, on the other hand, says the governor took a very tough stance on slave trade, and he insisted that it should be put an end to. He did not want people to be kidnapped. If people wanted to go on their own volition, then there was a court of inquiry where they would come and say, yes, they were going on their own, and only then was it permitted. And in every ship, not more than 10 slaves could be sent out. So this was Yale's, very clearly Yale's edicts at that point of time. But we don't know whether he was involved or whether he was not involved in the slave trade. He remained very careful about it. In the 1680s, when things were going swimmingly well for Yale, Mrs. Yale having gone back, Mrs. Nix doing very well, Mrs. D. Paiva giving him all the information he needs and all that, a lawyer comes down from England, William Fraser, and he becomes a member of the council. William Fraser is that kind of a man who wishes that all profit should be made only by himself, and that if other people are making money, they should be put down. So there are two kinds of leaders. One kind of leader is where you also have, I also will make money. Let all of us be happy. The other kind of leader is only I should make money. You should be unhappy. So we've also seen all that. So Fraser was clearly the other kind. Yale was of the first variety. Everybody should make money in the council. Nobody should complain against each other. So Fraser is an indefatigable memo writer. for every action of the governor, for every debate in the council, there'll be one letter going, and then one copy will be sent to East India Company in England so that they know exactly what is happening. The Prada எழுதுறதுங்கிறது தமிழ்ல ரொம்ப famous. The complaint letter writing. मैंने file में उसको ऐसे मारा. In Delhi, you know, they would say this whenever I have been to any government, I have killed him in the file. So this is exactly what William Fraser was doing at that time. This road is Fraser Road, by the way, in Georgetown. It's named after that cranky, notorious William Fraser, who was going to make life very difficult for Yale and the Knickses. And Yale and Fraser, they fall out with each other. There are bitter conflicts in council between 1689 and 1690-91. And finally, a commission of inquiry arrives from England. Sir John Goldsborough is sent down to investigate what the hell is Yale doing. Having arrived over here, the commission of inquiry then starts. Both sides begin to put up their papers and things like that. Action is immediately taken by the court at that time. Nicks is ordered to be arrested because he is the agent in Coonie and from him only, a lot of money is coming to the governor from Nicks. Nicks immediately approaches his friend, Dr. Edward Bulkeley. This is Bulkeley's gravestone. It is just opposite General Hospital. And Bulkeley does, for the first time, something that has become very common in Tamil Nadu history. Nicks is just going to go to prison. Bulkeley issues him a medical certificate saying he is ill. He cannot be sent to prison. He has to be taken to hospital. So Nicks is taken to the General Hospital and he is admitted over there to be under the watch and ward of Dr. Edward Bulkeley. I don't know if they clapped him in irons and had a ball attached to his foot and all that, but he is now safely in the General Hospital. He can't be arrested. Mrs. Nicks is going to be arrested next. And she apparently needed an entire cohort of soldiers with muskets to go and fetch her. So she must have been some kind of a woman, And eventually she's placed in prison. Yale is dismissed and all his properties are sequestered. The charges are exactly as how a modern political vendetta charge would be. Fraud in public infrastructure building first. That is, a protective wall had to be built all around the city of Madras, mud wall. Hosea Child had made it very clear that the company will not spend its money on it. The citizens of this Madras city will have to spend money on it. Now, citizens of Madras city have never spent any money on infrastructure. They've only criticized infrastructure. Poor Yale decided that we won't wait for them because our security will be a big problem. Let's build the wall at the company expense. Now he was told that company has never approved it and the wall is in very bad condition. It's exactly like na poi paathen flyover illa and edathila road illa ore kuliya irundhudu. So there's been rain has come, the wall has been battened down or whatever. So now he's ordered to pay the entire cost of building the wall. That's taken away from his estate. Next thing is killing people who are not amenable to his ways. 3 people in the council died of natural causes, but Fraser had filed murder charges against Yale, saying that he had poisoned them with little known Asiatic poisonings, and that is how they had died. Then helping his own kinsmen, which we all recognize is part of our duty. Thomas Yale, his younger brother, had come down and he had been helped tremendously by Yale. He had become an independent merchant. He was helping the governor in every way. So all these were, and of course, corruption, earning money far beyond his station in life, living, very comfortably and so on and so forth. So Yale then decides to defend himself, but he does it in a very careful fashion. He remains here. They give him an opportunity to go back to England. This is 1692. He's told, you've been dismissed. You can go back to England. He doesn't show any signs of moving out. He's living in Fort St. George as the former governor. And Mrs. D. Paiva is there to take care of him. They have had a child also by that time. His name is Carlos, because I named obviously from that side of the family and not from the Elihu side of the family. He's had a child from his mistress. And his stepson is coming back from England to join the East India Company. When he comes here, he finds that he's got a step brother, whom he didn't know about all along. So all these things have happened, and Yale doesn't show any signs of going out. So eventually, Thomas is sent on a ship back to England. with a defense by Yale addressed not to the East India Company, not to the judge over here, but to the Privy Council in England. So Thomas goes back. Mrs. Nix pays for her bail. She leaves in a ship as well, goes back to England. Nix is still in prison. Nobody thought of bailing him out. He is a useless husband. Let him be here. It doesn't matter. He is stuck here. Eventually, the letters reach England. And in 1695, Thomas begins badgering the Privy Council. Obviously, a lot of money had been paid to Privy Council members, and the inquiry begins. And when they read Yale's defense, it's basically, in today's world, this defense wouldn't have held water, because the next minute by WhatsApp, that information would have come here. But you can imagine 1.5 years, the letter traveling, or 6 months traveling, then 1 year over there, then the judge taking a decision. It says, I am held prisoner against my wishes in Madras city. I fear for my life. All my properties have been sequestered by the company. And all these are my honest earnings. And I don't know now what to do. I'm in great mortal danger. Now, none of this was true. He was a free man living over here. He did not want to go back to England, but he had lied his way through that letter, fully confident that nobody would have anticipated this in Madras. Even William Fraser wouldn't have anticipated it. The Privy Council, obviously influenced heavily by Yale's money, chose to open up an investigation on how the East India Company was making a profit. East India Company immediately got cold feet, exonerated Yale of all charges, and said, you're a free man. Because rather than suffer this indignity, and probably they'll find a lot more of what we are doing, so let's exonerate him and get rid of the problem. So by 1696, a pardon has arrived in Madras. He is now free to go back to England. He's not in a hurry. He still stays here for 3 years, settling all his affairs and things like that, making sure that money is being sent back. Eventually, in 1699, he goes back to England. There he builds a house for himself in a very upmarket locality called Queen Square. He has his ancestral home in Plas Grono in Wales. So he divides his time between these two places. Nix goes back with him to England, but Mrs. Nix does not like England. For her, her heart and mind was here. She was an original lover of Madras. So she was a Madrasi. So she comes back in 1701 to take care of Yale's business interests in Madras, his warehouses, his properties, his rental incomes and all that. So the Nixes and some of their children, they all return back to India in 1701 and they live here. Yale lives a very happy life in England thereafter, moves around with the aristocracy, spends his money on buying books, on buying portraits. He's a great patron of the arts. Whenever a new book that he likes needs money for publishing, he funds it. He likes cartographers. He's a rich man in society. He's a nabob. And from there, he writes letters to Mrs. Nix very regularly on business matters and all that. And 50 letters have survived of the correspondence between Mr. Yale and Mrs. Nix. In some of them, he refers to his wife, and you can make out that things are not very happy. So he says, this crazed harebrained toad is my problem, and who is always addicted to her bottle. He doesn't refer to her by name. Obviously, Mrs. Yale was an alcoholic, or she was into laudanum or one of those drugs or some such thing. And he doesn't like it, but she is spending all her time with her daughters in a country house. He is living in London. And then his daughters marry into the cream of aristocracy. One of them marries the son of Lord Norton Grey. The other one marries the younger son of the Duke of Devonshire. This is a portrait of him sitting with the Duke of Devonshire. He's sitting in the middle. And you've got a slave boy, as you can see over there in the corner. This big question is, whose slave boy is that? Whether it is that of Yale or whether it's that of the Duke himself. Nobody knows this at this point of time. At this time, from America, the Reverend Cotton Mather is sending out letters. The Reverend Cotton Mather is a priest or is a clergyman in America, and he has heard of the wealth of Elihu Yale, and they are going to start a new college in America. And when Yale's father went out in that ship in 1636, there was a clergyman in the same ship called John Harvard. And Harvard funded Harvard University. So probably that legend stuck in the family or whatever it was. Yale was quite enamored with this idea that, some college was coming up and he needed to send money. But at that time, one of his great speculations had crashed and he was a little short of liquidity. He sends out books, cloth, and a portrait of King George I, all of which is auctioned and around 800 pounds is made out of it. And they decide to name the college as Yale College. He's quite flattered by that. But what he doesn't like is that the Reverend Cotton Mather has obviously decided that more and more money can be obtained from this benefactor from the fact that the college has been named after him. But Yale, by the time, has become a member of the Society for the Promotion of the Gospel in England. And he is very clearly a high church man. He doesn't like a group of dissenters in America, Puritans, who are not liking the the way the Protestants are running their church in England, bishops, well-to-do bishops, all big made and, living in lives of luxury and things like that. So he stops his funding thereafter and he never responds to any of the letters, but the name has already been given. What is very interesting is that the bigger benefactor of the college was a man called Jeremiah Dummer. But you can't name a college as Dummer's College, right? So they decide that Yale College is far better and eventually it becomes Yale University. Yale lives a happy life and dies in 1721 in his house in London in Queen Square. Sometime in between, he has amused himself in writing a will. Now that will is unfortunately is not signed, but it gives you a clear idea as to how his mind was working, on whom he wanted to leave, what money for, and all that. The Nicks's children are major beneficiaries. His own children are there. All that is there. The last line is to my wicked wife. And then there is a blank line. He hasn't filled it, obviously, at that time. What he doesn't realize is that he's going to die without a will because he's not signed this. So it goes intestate. And then Catherine Hinmer, this is one of the letters that he's written to Mrs. Nicks. Mrs. Nicks has died in Madras in 1709. She's dead. Husband is dead. Some of the children have carried on over here. And in the meantime, Yale himself passes away in 1721. And Catherine, his wife, thereafter lives for a good period of time. She lives on for another 8 to 9 years, very happily with her daughters, living off the money that Yale had left behind for her. This is his epitaph, which he wrote himself. Born in America, in Europe, bred, in Africa traveled, and in Asia wed. Where long he lived and thrived, in London dead. Much good, some ill he did, so hope all is even, and that his soul through mercies gone to heaven. You that survive and read this tale, take care, for those must certain exit to prepare. Where blessed in peace, the actions of the just smell sweet and blossom in the silent dust. So this was the epitaph that he wrote himself. And finally, that is there this is part of the handwriting of Mrs. Yale, who lives on for quite some time, for another 8 to 9 years, and then passes away quite peacefully and is buried in a different church, not where Yale is buried. But the legacy has continued. It's quite clear from the settlements, the figures today, when translated, are quite mind-boggling. Mrs. Yale's estate in today's value is £3.5 million. And one of the stepsons, that is Hinmer's sons, actually sues the estate of Yale, saying that he never got the settlement that was due to him. And that decision by the courts in England was given even when Yale was alive. He makes a settlement on that boy, and that was equal to £1 million, equivalent to what we would today recognize as £1 million. So it's quite obvious that the Yale legacy was probably 10 to 15 million pounds in current value. That was the kind of money that he could make in Madras city on a salary that never exceeded £100 per annum. So it's quite obvious that it didn't come through honest living or simple living and high thinking. It came through speculation and a lot of commission earning on every transaction that he had taken care of in this city. He left behind a huge tradition. That's all I wish to say. Thank you very much. Last slide before I forget. All this would have never come to light without Hiram Bingham in 1939 writing the life of Elihu Yale. Hiram Bingham was an American senator. He's the man who discovered Machu Picchu in South America. And he was an alumnus of Yale University. And he came down to Madras, researched the life of Yale, and in 1939 wrote the book, Elihu Yale, American Nabob of Queen Square. And that really forms the first documentation of Yale's life. Thereafter, we've had other books that have come out. Thank you very much. Yeah, so from tomorrow onward, there are a whole lot of programs, all virtual, and you can see the details in the Madras Musings website, madrasmusings.com. Then they've also been extensively shared on social media like Twitter, Facebook, and all that. If you go to my Twitter handles or social media handles, you will find the programs all there. So every day in the evening, we have at least one event starting from tomorrow. They'll all be virtual. And then eventually they'll be put up on the Madras Musings YouTube channel as well. Thank you so much. Thank you. No, there's no portrait of his. His marriage register is there. His signing in Fort St. George after his marriage. That is there.